As part of your proxy statement filed with the SEC, you will disclose whether any of your insiders, your directors, or executive officers were delinquent in filing their Forms 3s, 4s, or 5s with the SEC over the last fiscal year. Today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of you. So before I bring on Alan Dye, did he invent Section 16? No, I think he invented the internet. To explain how to provide this disclosure in more detail, let's run down some of the basics. The legal requirements. As referenced in Item B of Schedule 14A, the requirement to disclose insiders reporting delinquencies on Section 16 reports appears in Item 405 of Regulation SK. The disclosure is also required by Item 10 of Form 10K, but General Instruction G3 to Form 10K allows you to incorporate that proxy disclosure by reference. So what is a delinquency? A Section 16 filing made after its due date, that's obvious enough. A complete failure to file, that's considered a delinquency too. Even Section 16 filings that don't say much, if they're late, they're late. They're late. A Form 3 where the insider does not own any of the company's securities, a transaction exempt from Section 16B. If they're late, they're late. What to disclose? Well, let's start with the good news. If the company is not aware of any disclosable delinquencies, you're not required to make an affirmative statement regarding compliance with Section 16A. I call it negative disclosure, but a lot of people call it affirmative disclosure. In fact, Instruction 1 to Item 405A encourages companies to exclude the caption altogether if there are no delinquencies to report, no late Section 16 filings. But some companies like to brag and include an affirmative statement, include disclosure that to the company's knowledge, all directors and executive officers have complied with their Section 16A reporting over the last fiscal year. And here's an example of this type of disclosure. Now for the bad news. You have disclosable delinquencies that you're going to have to include in your proxy. So the SEC gives you a lot of flexibility here. There's no prescribed format under Item 405 other than the caption. That's set in stone by Item 405A1, Delinquent Section 16A reports. That's the required caption. No changes can be made. So the insider who's delinquent gets identified in the proxy by name. They're typically not wild about that, having their name in the proxy as having a delinquent report. Item 405A1 requires you to name each insider who committed a disclosable violation. Item 405A2 notes that for each delinquent insider, the company is required to disclose three things. 1, the number of delinquent reports. 2, the number of transactions not reported on a timely basis. And 3, any known failure to file a required report, including a delinquency from a prior fiscal year that became known during this past fiscal year. So here's an example of what this disclosure looks like. The silver lining, if there is one, is that you don't need to describe the delinquent transactions, such as their nature, the number of securities involved, or the period of time that the report was delinquent. You don't have to disclose how delinquent it was. But you can voluntarily include this or any other information that you want that's relevant to the delinquency, any mitigating circumstances. And Alan and I will talk about whether that's a good idea and what that might look like. But trust me, this section is short. The disclosures are brief, rarely consisting of more than a paragraph or two. Under Instruction 2 to Item 405, you only need to disclose something about a particular delinquent filing only once. So once it's disclosed as delinquent, that's it. You don't have to repeat it in the following year. Even if the delinquency has not been cured, it's still ongoing. Once you've disclosed it once, you're fine. Of course, that increases the insider's risk of being looked at by the SEC Enforcement Division the longer the delinquency goes. But whatever, for terms of the proxy disclosure, you're only disclosing it once. To kick off the Item 405 information, some companies summarize the requirements of Section 16A. Others provide the bare minimum, just the required disclosure about the identity of the late filers, the number of late reports, and the transactions. And here's an example of this disclosure. Diligence. Alan is going to discuss the company's diligence requirements in more detail. That's laid out in Item 405B. I will say this, finding out about a delinquent Section 16A report after you filed and delivered your proxy, but before your annual shareholders meeting is held, is the worst. Here's an example of a company that had to file additional soliciting material because of this kind of situation where the proxy's been mailed, but the meeting hasn't happened yet. And here's another example of this kind of disclosure It happens more often perhaps than you would think. Anyways, let's bring on Alan Dye. So my guest today is Alan Dye, a partner at Hogan, Lovell's, editor of Section16.net. I've known Alan for nearly 20 years, such a great guy, such a great friend, and such a smart man. I've learned so much of what I know from Alan. He doesn't know it probably, but it's true. He does not know just Section 16. Trust me, he knows everything you need to know about the securities law. So I'm really grateful that he can have some time with us to teach us a little bit about what we need to know. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point.
Quick Zips by Zippy Point.
Quick and dirty. So Alan, I got to start with this picture of us from 15 years ago because I still think you look the same. And I think I looked older back in 2004 than I do now, but I know I'm just fooling myself.
Yeah, you're ageless, Brock. You look young there and you still look young.
That's the beauty of being bald. All right, so Section 16 disclosures. It actually has become one of my favorite topics because it's not too complicated compared to some of the others. And so it's so great for you to be with us, Alan, and since you're the man in this area. So I'm going to start you off by asking you, what's the typical process that a company uses to diligence whether an insider has delinquencies that they're going to have to disclose in their proxy?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. The due diligence process for Item 405 really starts as part of the compliance program for Section 16A reporting compliance. Companies, for the most part, help their insiders file reports on time, so they know before they get to the end of the year and it's time to think about Item 405 disclosure of delinquencies, what delinquencies occurred. But nevertheless, at the end of the year, there are a few steps the company typically takes. Number one, they will check the Edgar system. Since Item 405 says that companies have an obligation to check the Edgar system to make sure that all required reports were filed or that those that were filed on time, companies do that. Another thing that companies do as part of the due diligence process is include in their directors and officers questionnaire in connection with the 10K and proxy statement in general. First, a question about the number of shares that the insider beneficially owns so that that number can be compared to the Forms 4 that are on file at the SEC. And the other is to include a certification. Again, that's something that's recommended by Item 405 itself. But they have a certification that usually accompanies the D&O questionnaire that asks the insiders, or at least the officers and directors, whether they filed all required reports and have an obligation, if they didn't, to file a Form 5. So that certification process causes the officer and director to reflect on the year and make sure that every transaction that should have been reported was actually reported or brought to the company's attention so the company could report it.
So that's just a CYA, the certification. It's not required by the SEC, and you don't have to keep it for 5 years or anything like that. If a director officer who was delinquent with their Forms 4s or I guess a Form 5 during the year, but then they left before the end of the fiscal year, do you still need to include delinquency disclosure in the proxy about that?
Yes, you do. Item 405 says that the company has to due diligence and then make disclosures about any person who was subject to Section 16 at any time during the fiscal year. So if somebody came on new toward the end of the fiscal year, or as you suggest, they left in the middle of the year, the company still needs to make disclosure about their delinquencies if they had any.
Yeah, so if it's a new officer or director, that would be a Form 3 could be late, and then that would be included as well. So Alan, how do you handle Form 5 since those are due after a company's fiscal year end? If any of those are late, do they belong in that fiscal year that just ended, or do they belong in the fiscal year, it's Valentine's Day, and that Valentine's Day occurs?
Yeah, Item 405 doesn't make that entirely clear, but I think the better reading of Item 405 is that a Form 5, if filed late or not filed at all, is disclosable in the proxy statement in 10K that covers the same year that the Form 5 would have covered. So if, as you suggest, there's let's say a late Form 5 filed February 15th, that late Form 5 should be reported in the proxy statement. The company's in the process of preparing it. Covers that prior fiscal year. But it's not really a concern because the SEC staff took the position a long time ago in an interpretive letter that companies don't need to worry about that issue as long as the delinquency is disclosed either in the current proxy statement or is disclosed in next year's proxy statement as a late report for that fiscal year, then the disclosure obligation has been satisfied. What companies usually do, as I'm sure you know, is that if they have item 405 delinquencies to disclose in the current proxy statement, they'd like to go ahead and get the late Form 5 disclosed in the same proxy statement so they can get it all out of the way at one time and not have delinquency disclosures next year if they can avoid additional delinquencies during the year.
Yeah, dealer's choice, get out the bad news as soon as possible. What about an error in a Section 16 filing? Does that somehow render the filing delinquent if you're filing an amended Form 4?
That's a very tough question to answer in the abstract. What item 405 requires is disclosure of a late form or a failure to file a form. So if you file a report on time, say it's a Form 3 or a Form 4, but there's a mistake in it, are you late or have you failed to file? And I think generally the view of practitioners and the SEC staff is that some errors could be so significant or so material that they might render the filing either not having been made or the transaction not having been reported. For the most part, just looking at practice over the years and what people disclose in proxy statements, just about the only error in a Form 4 or a Form 3 or Form 5 for that matter would be failure to include, that would trigger a disclosure in a proxy statement would be omission of a transaction or a holding from a Form 3 or a transaction from a Form 4 or Form 5, or misreporting the number of shares involved in a transaction reported in Form 4 or Form 5. Whether or not that error warrants disclosure under item 405 is a matter of judgment. Different lawyers reach different conclusions or apply different standards based on the same facts. But the short answer to your question is yes, an error in a filed report can nevertheless be disclosable under item 405, even if the report was filed on time.
What about if the company has no delinquencies to disclose, they have the option of not including a section in the proxy about Section 16 reporting, but some companies do. I call it negative disclosure, but a lot of people call it affirmative disclosure. But they're basically saying we did a good job with our insiders, or our insiders did a good job with themselves, and they didn't have any delinquencies this year. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I'm somewhat agnostic on the practice. When item 405 was first adopted back in 1991 and became applicable to public companies, companies were afraid of leaving out a disclosure because they'd pick up last year's proxy statement and that would be their model for preparing this year's proxy statement. If they didn't have a section on item 405 delinquencies, there was a fear that they'd forget to go back and check for that due diligence. And so companies made the voluntary disclosure. As part of the disclosure simplification process, a year or so ago, the SEC adopted amendments to item 405, changed the caption for the item 405 disclosures, and included an instruction in item 405 discouraging companies from including that voluntary disclosure, just to reduce the amount of text in proxy statements. Some companies are doing it and some aren't. Personally, I think I would eliminate it. I wouldn't be afraid that next year I'd forget that I have an item 405 disclosure obligation because I'd have a disclosure checklist or have someone doing a rules check. But for those who reach a different conclusion, I think it's perfectly reasonable. And if they'd like to do that, either as a placeholder or, as you said, to brag about their compliance program, I don't have any kind of problem with it. I did check exactly 100 proxy statements this year in connection with another project, as I think you know, just to get an idea of what companies were doing in response to the new disclosure requirements. And of the companies that had delinquencies to disclose, about 22% of them, companies that didn't have a delinquency to disclose, 22% of those companies nevertheless included the caption and said, we did a good job, we didn't have any delinquencies.
Yeah. So if you do have a delinquency, what does the disclosure typically say?
Well, all that's required is to say, if it's a Form 4, the number of late reports and the number of transactions reported late. Most companies start off with a sentence that says, Section 16A requires our officers, directors, and 10% owners to file reports of their transactions in and ownership of the company's stock, which is a voluntary disclosure. And then they get to the delinquencies. Most often, it's a brief disclosure. We had full compliance with the Section 16A reporting requirements, except for John Doe and Jane Doe, each of whom was late in filing one Form 4 to report an option grant during the year. Companies tend to dress that up a little bit with some mitigating disclosure. They usually refer to the failures to report on time as inadvertent disclosures or inadvertent errors in meeting the filing deadlines. Sometimes they'll attribute the error to computer problems, and, to make it sound less significant. At least not an oversight in the compliance program. And they'll also, when they can, minimize, in some respects, the nature of the transaction. And they say, even though they're required to disclose only the number of transactions late, they may say one transaction, 1 day late, involved only 200 shares, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I just was looking at a couple of proxies before this. I saw one that said it was due to company personnel making a mistake, so it wasn't the insider's fault. It was a company, someone inside the company was filing the forms for them. And then another company disclosed that it was actually the filing software's problem. They didn't identify which software program they used, but they laid the blame off on a third party.
Yeah, well, it's pretty common for it to be made clear, whatever the disclosure looks like, that it's not the insider's fault.
Yeah. So in terms of how often late filings occur, it seems, it happens, and it happens sometimes after you file your proxy. I found a number of additional soliciting material, proxy supplements filed because delinquencies were found after the fact, after the proxy statement's already been filed with the SEC. Presumably it's already been delivered to the shareholders, but yet companies still, between the date of the filing of the proxy and the date of the shareholders meeting, they found out they had other delinquencies. And so they made additional disclosures.
Yeah.
And so the last question is about the removal. I'm just taped another video on the 10K cover page. So I guess in 2019, the SEC removed the checkbox on the cover of the 10K cover page. There was an odd checkbox because you left it blank. If you would check the box if you were okay, not if you had delinquency. So if the box was blank, then the SEC staff could look at that and be, oh, okay, there was some delinquencies here. And then every dozen, 15 years, the enforcement division at the SEC conducts some sort of sweep. And I assume they were relying on those check boxes to conduct those, the once a decade sweeps, but I don't know what they're going to do, a decade from now, since I guess there was a sweep about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see. But did the SEC ever express a reason why they wanted to remove that from the cover page?
They did in the release that adopted the disclosure simplification amendments recently, not in great detail, but you're right. Originally, when that checkbox was put on the cover of 10K, the thought was that companies would essentially be self-reporting delinquencies by their insiders because they wouldn't check the box, and that would be a mechanism that enforcement could use to determine where there were late filings. I don't think they use that system anymore. I don't think they even use the item 405 disclosures in the proxy statement anymore, which is why they didn't need to have that checkbox. In their most recent sweep, which was in 2014, their press release said, we have these new, I've forgotten exactly what the expression was, quantitative analytics. Quantitative analytics now enable us to quickly and efficiently determine who's complying and who's not. So I think whatever they're doing now with their computer systems has superseded the old look on the cover page of the 10K or even look at the item 405 disclosures in the proxy statement. They find them on their own. So they thought, we don't really need to have that checkbox on the 10K because that's not for investors, it's for the SEC's enforcement division, which really means that the item 405 disclosure is there, it's a separate punishment track. If you're a really delinquent insider, you may pick up an SEC enforcement action, but most of the time, you're going to be publicly shamed for not filing your reports on time by having yourself identified in the company's proxy statement.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Alan.
Great. Thank you, Brock. Good to see you, even virtually.